Hello and welcome back to Tranquility du Jour, nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life with doses of tranquility. Episode 505. I'm your host, Kimberly Wilson, bringing you tranquility since 2005. This month is officially our 15th year, so happy 15-year anniversary. Today, I'm talking with Rachel Burton about owning yoga studios, writing books, living as an INFJ, and more. And before we dive into my interview with Rachel, I wanted to let you know about a few events that are coming up. So first, we've got Fall TDJ Live happening next week, Sunday, September 20th from 8 to 9 p.m. There's a link in the show notes, kimberlywilson.com/505, where you can sign up and join us for free. I also have a new e-course that will be launching this fall, and it's called TDJ Lifestyle, where we'll be diving into all 5 tenets of Tranquility du Jour. And there's a link in the show notes to join the waitlist. And then finally, the last thing I have scheduled is January 1st, 2021, New Year's virtual retreat. And that's happening from 2 to 5 Eastern Time. Would love to have you join us. And there's a link also for that in the show notes. A couple announcements. One is that the Daybook, I am debating a new edition of it and would love to know what you want more of, what you'd like less of, how you would like the latest edition to be a little different. And I'll put a link to the latest edition in the show notes. And then, of course, you can find it at kimberlywilson.com/shop. The second thing I wanted to mention is I was a guest last week on Alyssa, Dr. Alyssa Adams' podcast, The Uncommon Couch. We talk all about intuition, decision-making, creating a sacred space for clients, and more. So I think you would probably enjoy that, and I will have a link to that over in the show notes. It's always fun to have the microphone reversed. And also, we are recording from a farmhouse out in Cape Charles, Virginia. We're out here for the week. I got Tim a little getaway gift for his birthday, which is tomorrow. And of course, we have our grumble of pugs. And this morning we started the day at the beach. Just absolutely lovely. And it's only a 4-hour drive from DC. So I think we've kind of fallen in love with this area. Anyway, so it may be a bit echoey or whatnot because we are in a very large room. And I will be posting photos over on the blog and in social media. So be sure to check it out because it's absolutely adorable. And there are 2 clawfoot tubs. So there's a whole upstairs level that we won't be using because we don't need this many bedrooms. But it has 2 clawfoot tubs up there, and that's kind of what made me fall in love with this place. Now, without further ado, Rachel is an author. Her pen name is Rachel Burton. She's a yoga teacher, paralegal, and invisible illness advocate. She writes novels about love and loves tea, the Beatles, ice hockey, and dresses with pockets. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
It's a treat to have you with us today. And, before we dive in, and we're going to talk, of course, a bit about your books, and there's so much I think that you have to share with our listeners. Can you give us a bit about your background and, how you got to kind of where you are right now?
Okay, sure. So my background is, and I know you're going to laugh when you hear this because it's very similar to yours. I was a paralegal for many years, and I'd always practiced yoga, which is how I came across your blog in the first place. And it was fine, the job, but it was a bit like, okay, there must be something else in life to do. So I trained as a yoga teacher, which seemed like the logical next step from having practiced yoga for many years. And for a while, I taught yoga and worked. So I would work in the day and then go home and teach yoga classes at night. And there's only so long you can maintain that kind of lifestyle. So I took the plunge and became a yoga teacher. And that was around 2000 and 9, 10, something like that. And I had a small yoga studio in Cambridge, in the UK, over here in the UK. And so I taught as a yoga teacher, and that's sort of my background in yoga. And while I was doing that, I have always written stories, made up stories. And I wrote one that sort of turned into a book one day, and I was, what shall I do with this story? And after much like, oh no, it's terrible, like, it's awful, no one should read it, my friends encouraged me to start sending it out to agents and publishers. And eventually, after lots and lots of rejection, it got accepted. So that's my journey from paralegal to fiction writer via yoga teacher. So a strange combination of things, but that's how I got here.
And now, so tell us a little bit about the yoga studio.
So it was very small. We had one teaching studio for about 15 students, and then we had 2 rooms for smaller classes or one-to-ones or therapists, massage therapists, that kind of treatments like that. And I rented out space to other therapists and other teachers, and we had a lovely little community going in Cambridge with lots of regular clients, and it's a lot of fun. It was a really, really good thing to do, and I don't regret it for a moment. But it also took over my whole life. In a way that, I was always thinking about it. I was always checking emails. I was always thinking about the next thing we could do. I was always working with the other therapists to make sure that everything was at the highest level we could be at. And it got to a point where I thought, I am not doing, I don't even feel that I can go away for a few days because of the studio. And that's when I started thinking about what I should do and how I should move on from here, how I could get away from this kind of all-consuming feeling that the studio was bringing.
Yeah. As you say,
you're laughing like you recognize that.
Right. Yeah. And I think the piece that is also pretty interesting kind of about you as a writer, and what we started talking about before I hit the record button, was being an INFJ, which I relate to. And, we're the most rare of the Myers-Briggs kind of
apparently.
But you know what's so interesting, Rachel, is there are so many people that I've come into contact with through the Tranquility du Jour work who are INFJs. So Tim always jokes, he's like, yeah, they're so rare, but like everybody is one.
Same.
Really?
Because I've come across lots from firstly through the yoga community, and secondly writers. And people who I've sort of met through social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram. And but I think that that's a place where, they're both communities and places where the INFJs are drawn to, because it's not that we don't like people per se. It's just the long group interactions, face to face, can be very draining and exhausting for us. We need that time to come away from that and debrief. And I think that's why I think those sort of communities we're drawn to, like yoga, writing, we meet a lot of other INFJs, and you think, oh, maybe we're not so rare, but probably in the grand scheme of things, if you look outside those communities, there'd be less of us, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. We'll just have to tell Tim and your husband that.
Yeah.
We are special snowflakes.
Not so rare.
We just congregate.
Yeah. Yes, we do. We're drawn to each other, I think.
And for our listeners who are like, what in the world is an INFJ? Like, how would you describe it?
I think perhaps one of the descriptions I read once was an outgoing introvert. So the difference between an introvert and extrovert is less to do with whether we're shy or whether we're confident, and more to do with how we choose to spend our free time and where we get our energy. So extroverts really get their energy from being with other people. They really love bouncing ideas off other people, spending time with other people. And introverts get their energy from spending time alone. And they find, while they're not, they don't dislike other people. They have friends, they go out and network and do group stuff. But that can be very exhausting, so they need to pull back and spend time on their own to regroup and get their energy. And I think with an INFJ in particular, we're very interested in other people, and we're very interested in people's passions and what makes people tick. So we do have this sort of outgoing side to our nature that means we can come across as the opposite of what people think introverts are. And it was, for me, it was years before I realized I was an introvert. I never really understood the difference until I was sort of in my late 20s. And then I was like, oh, that explains why when I do all the stuff other people do, why I get so tired and they don't. So it was a real eye-opener for me when I understood that, certainly. So I think that's how I see it anyway.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were talking, I was like, oh, let me see, I just want to pull up what is out there kind of on the internet. Because I think you're right. It's like, we know these certain things, or we've read these certain things along the way. And then it's always interesting to be like, okay, so what is like the overarching piece that, I think makes INFJs a bit more unique. And it says creative nurturers with a strong sense of personal integrity and a drive to help others realize their potential. Creative and dedicated, they have a talent for helping others with original solutions to their personal challenges. Although they are sensitive, they are also reserved. INFJ is a private sort, selective about sharing intimate thoughts and feelings. And
that's very true.
Right?
Yeah, very, very true. Totally resonates, all of that. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
So it's 2% of the general population, 2% of women, 1% of men, and some famous INFJs, Eleanor Roosevelt, Emily Bronte, Carl Jung, Florence Nightingale, Jimmy Carter. So
wow.
Yeah, interesting.
So you see, you can be an introvert and still be famous.
Totally. They want a meaningful life and deep connections with other people. Do not tend to share themselves freely, but appreciate emotional intimacy with a select committed few. Yeah, really interesting, right?
And I think that idea of connection on a slightly deeper level is one of the reasons we're drawn to yoga as well. You said you'd come across, you'd met many people who identified as INFJ through the yoga community, and I think that is understandable. That's definitely that idea of learning about ourselves on a sort of deeper level is really something that an INFJ would be drawn to, I think.
Absolutely. And writing, right?
Yes,
writing. But one of the things that you mentioned, is how hard, though, it was kind of managing and running or operating the studio kind of with this personality. And that's one of the things that I kind of figured out, but about like year 16 of the business. So you were a little smarter sooner, but I'm curious.
I think you were younger when you started teaching, though, to be fair, because I think we're about the same age. So, we probably worked it out about the same point in our lives.
So, how would you describe that, right? If people were like, what do you mean it was hard to be an INFJ and run a business that, manages a lot of people or a lot of moving parts?
Yeah, I think it's the moving parts. There was a lot going on all at the same time. Anyone who's been to any yoga studio, whether a small one or a big, corporate one, or even gyms, will know that there's always timetabling issues. There's always teachers that don't show up. There's always something that needs mopping up or cleaning up, or redecorating, and it's just keeping on top of all those moving parts, as well as managing a team of people. And of course, being there, I was teaching as well. So of course I had to be there, be very present, hold space for the clients that I was teaching, both in groups and one-to-one. And it's a lot of stuff when you find being with big groups of people or being in meetings, very draining. And yeah, it did. There was a big difference from the leap from just teaching yoga to being a studio owner in terms of the amount of energy I had to give out. And I think it was harder to have clear boundaries. The boundaries were constantly changing, I think, because like you say, there's all those moving parts. And again, it didn't, it certainly wasn't something that I worked out very quickly. It took me a while to go, why am I finding this so hard? And so that's how I found it, that all these different things that needed constant attention took away perhaps some space I needed for myself to withdraw from that. And certainly as we got busier, as we expanded, I found that became more so, if that makes sense. It just, there was always something that I felt needed doing or needed attending to, or somebody I needed to have a conversation with or a meeting with.
Yeah, I think the thing about this that I love hearing is it helps me recognize like how common this is. And what I mean by that is the recognition, that, okay, what I'm doing right now is not really, it's not conducive to who I am. And I'm just figuring that out, or the way I'm changing or evolving or growing. And, for our listeners, I think that, my hope with this is to be able to, take the Myers-Briggs test. There's a lot of free ones online that will give
and
you.
And it's a really interesting thing to do. My husband did it a few years ago, and it was like you could almost see the light bulb go off above his head. He was like, oh, that explains why I find this difficult and that difficult. I think it can really help with self-awareness.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great for self-awareness. And then also just to see like, is, the way I'm spending my free time, maybe if you're like volunteering and doing a lot of really big things where it just feels like draining. Sometimes it can be helpful to look at, okay, I'm better at stuffing envelopes than, managing a gala. I mean, there's just things like this that I think can be so helpful. For when we're like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Why isn't this working?
Especially as I think there's a lot of pressure on us through social media and other outlets of the things we think we should be doing. And we're all very different. And just because one person finds this thing very rewarding doesn't mean we all will. And I think it helps bring a bit of perspective to that as well, that you're not somehow failing because you're not doing what you perceive other people to be doing. You have to do you, basically.
Right.
And I think the Myers-Briggs is a really good starting point to working out what it is that you need to do for yourself.
Right. Yeah. And so, I'm curious, kind of transitioning into your writing. So you said you've kind of always been a writer, and how did you, I think this is a really tough piece for people, is to figure out, okay, how do I make time and space for it? So were you able to start writing while you had the studio, or did you wait until that had passed?
I did some while I had the studio. I've always had a blog, so I've always written for that. And the studio had its own blog. So there was I wrote a lot of yoga related stuff. I'd written articles for yoga magazines and that kind of thing. I probably, while I had the studio, did less sort of playing around with fiction writing, just because I did not have the time or the energy to do that. However, it was while I had the studio that I came up with the idea for my debut novel. So yeah, there was definitely a crossover for sure. And I actually wrote it. I wrote the first draft of it during the period when I was selling the studio, which sounds crazy, but it was quite a long, drawn out process, and it took several months. It took the best part of a year actually to get everything completed. And during that year, I was slowly handing over more and more teaching, more and more management to other people. So I had free time, but I also had this kind of little ball of stress sitting on my shoulders all the time that, really until this is all signed, sealed and delivered, it's still mine, in inverted commas. And I started writing the book because it was a distraction from that, to be honest. And the big question, obviously, that everyone asks is, where do you find the time? How do you make the time to do it? And I read quite a long time ago now, I can't remember when it was, and I'm not going to be able to remember the name of the book or the author, but it's the one about how many hours we have in the week. I know you've read it as well.
168 Hours by Laura Vanderkam.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Total mind blank then when I knew I was going to mention this as well. And it made me realize that that's actually quite a lot of hours that we have. So it's something that I'd been thinking about for a while. What do we do with this time? How is the best way to spend it? And this kind of loops around with what you were saying about doing the Myers-Briggs test, that finding out, that kind of finding out those things about yourself can help you work out what sort of things to prioritize in your free time. And I think it really is a case of priorities. I don't have children. My children like yours have fur. So I do have, I'm not constantly doing school runs or that kind of thing. So I do have free time in that sense. But I just had to be quite strict with myself. Do you want to get this book finished? Yes, you do. Is it more important to you than watching the next episode of whatever I was watching on Netflix? Yes, it is. Therefore, turn off Netflix, Rachel, for goodness sake, and get on with it. And I gave myself targets to hit, but they were very realistic. I think you can be over ambitious with any project and be sort of, I'm going to write 2,000 words every day, and you don't hit it for 3 days in a row and you kind of go, oh, okay, then I'm not going to manage this. Whereas if you say, I'm going to write 300 words a day, you know what, you're probably going to be able to do that. And eventually over time, 300 words becomes a book.
Absolutely, right? It's starting with these smaller kind of snippets. And once you get writing 300 words, you're like, I'm on a roll.
What I found, absolutely. What I found was I thought, right, I'm going to do my 300 words, and I get my laptop out. And actually, once I'd done 300, I was like, oh, I'm not ready to finish. I want to write this next bit. And you do, I don't know, 600, 800. So I think those, funnily enough, it's what I used to say to people about maintaining a home yoga practice. Get on your mat and do 5 minutes. And you'll find that 5 minutes becomes 15 minutes and 15 minutes becomes 20 minutes. I think if we set ourselves really quite low targets, we will meet them and exceed them. But if we set ourselves very high reaching targets, we're not going to do it. We're not. We're human. We're just not. And then we're setting ourselves up to fail, really, I think.
Well, and what led you into the genre that you do, romance?
It's a genre I've always loved reading. My first degree was in history and my master's is in English. So I always read a lot of very heavy tomes for my study. And, I read a lot of history books and classical texts for my first degree. And then obviously in my In my master's, I was reading things like a lot of Dickens and those very thick Victorian novels, George Eliot, that kind of thing. And I started reading romance because I wanted something lighter, something that wasn't so many pages, that I could just enjoy, and I could just really immerse myself in an escape for a few hours, And I think that's when my love of romance fiction first started, and I've always loved reading it. So from there, I think the romance genre has really developed over the last few years, and while it's still kind of sneered at by some people, you get remarks like, oh, romance novels, they're so easy to write, anyone could write those. Okay then. And people think it's a little bit inferior. It's an incredible antidote to what's happening in the world, and I feel that romance writers are sort of purveyors of good news, because you can guarantee that we'll have a happy ever after in our stories. So when the world is feeling like it's just awful and everything feels terrible, romance has always been there to give readers hope, I think. And that's certainly what drew me to reading it, and what I think drew me to writing in that genre as well. And certainly comments I've had from readers have always been, this thing was happening in my life when I read your book, and it really helped me get some perspective, or it really helped me find an escape from whatever it was that was happening. And it's those kind of comments that make me realize that, just as I was when I was teaching yoga, I am still helping people. It's just a different way of helping people. And also I get to do it quietly at home without having to have lots of meetings.
Exactly. Less moving parts, right?
Yeah, definitely less moving parts.
Well, and so how do you determine, what your next book is going to be? Do you have that in mind while you're writing the previous one? Or do they kind of build?
I usually have an idea for the next one towards the end of writing one. Yeah. And I have to make sure I'm not distracted by the new shiny idea. When it comes along, I tend to just write it down somewhere, make some notes, and then I have to make myself forget it, because obviously the new shiny idea is always more exciting than, what you've been working on for several months already. But yeah, I do usually get an idea for something else towards the end of writing what I'm writing at the moment. And I don't know. I'm going to preempt any questions about where I get my ideas from, because I don't know. I honestly don't know. They just sort of come into my head. And I'm sure they come from, observations of the world around me, conversations with friends, probably conversations I've overheard on the train, or, that sort of thing. So yes, it's a strange thing where the ideas come from, but you have to trust that they will come at the right time.
And so for kind of the writing and then just the management of everyday life, what are some of your daily non-negotiables? Like the things that are just critical for you to make part of your routine?
Meditation is a daily non-negotiable. I don't necessarily have a set time to do it. But I do always do at least 10 minutes of meditation every day. And sometimes I'll do 2. So if I'm having a particularly fraught day, I'll take myself off for a second session later on or something. So that's definitely a non-negotiable. My yoga practice is definitely a non-negotiable. Sometimes it's maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and other times it's an hour. It depends on how I'm feeling, what my energy is like, how busy I am that day. But I have a condition called fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain condition, and it's a very strange one that doctors don't really understand why people have it, although it's not super rare or anything. They suspect it's neurological. But one of the things about the pain is that movement helps it, particularly gentle movement like yoga. I used to have a very strong practice, a sort of Ashtanga vinyasa flow type practice, which I don't anymore. My practice is much more gentle, much more like a sort of gentle hatha restorative practice. But I know that if I don't do some movement every day, my body will not thank me for it, and my pain levels will not thank me for it. So they're my two big non-negotiables, to be honest.
Yeah, those are good ones. What about writing? Do you write like in a journal, or do you do a regular bit of writing every day?
I do write a journal. I've kept a journal since I was about, 10 or something. I hope that the quality of the writing in it has improved since I was 10. But I do write in my journal nearly every day. And as for fiction writing, it depends. It depends if I'm working on something, if I have a deadline coming up, if I've got a really good idea. But then I'll also take some time off every now and then. There was last summer, I took 3 months where I didn't write any fiction at all. And it was actually really interesting because I'd basically written 3 books back to back. I'd had 3 books come out in less than 3 years. I think it was within 2 years I'd had 3 books come out. So I'd been really writing them back to back. And I felt very like, I just can't quite get the idea for the next book. I just can't quite get my finger on it. And so I took this time off and I wasn't writing any fiction at all. I went and saw films. I read books. I just did nothing some days. And it kind of, my brain clicked back into place. So I think there's a school of thought that says write every day. And I'm not against that in a sort of journal writing, morning pages type thing. But I think if we try and push ourselves to try and write the book that we're writing every single day, or pushing ourselves to come up with the next idea, I don't necessarily think our brains quite work like that. I think you need to go out and feed the brain. I guess it's like artist dates, isn't it? In the artist's way, that's what they're called, where you just take yourself off to an exhibition or to a film, or just out for people watching in a cafe or something, and I think can just allow your brain to just start working again.
Yeah, artist dates are so powerful. And I think what you said is really important to keep in mind, that we're not always producing. It's like even with nature, everything's cyclical. And I think it's hard to remember that, because we love producing, and then to recognize that sometimes we have to refill the well.
And I think producing something has very high, it's very highly thought of, as though we're only succeeding if we've got something physical to produce at the end of the process, or to be regularly producing something new. And I think there's a limit to how much producing a person can do without taking time for themselves to refill a well, essentially, get new inspiration from somewhere else. And I know a lot of writers, the commercial fiction is very fast moving, especially now that so much of it is done digitally. So much commercial fiction is bought in ebook form. And so it can be produced very quickly. And, we get quite tight deadlines, and then we move on to the next book and the next book. So there's this real pressure sometimes to always be producing something, when actually to produce, you need to take time out to be inspired.
Yes.
And I think that's true of any creative work, whether you are a writer, an artist, a sculptor, photographer, I think that, or even, even if you're like a content creator on Instagram or YouTube, I think you there's a real demand to be always putting new content out there, putting something new out there. And we never take enough time to be re-inspired or to remember why we started doing it in the first place.
Yeah, such a good reminder. Such a good reminder. Right? It's and it's
for myself as much as anyone else, it's something I really have to keep reminding myself how important it is.
Yeah, it's critical. And even as you were listing the various professions or people who could be affected by that, I was even thinking like yoga studio owners, right? Anyone who is in like some sort of creative work, if you're just constantly trying to output.
Absolutely. And I don't know about you, but when I had the studio, I hardly ever got time to go to classes, even in my own studio. It's like, what's going on here? And I really faced like, I've not even been to a yoga class for 4 weeks or something. I'd suddenly realized, and that's the same thing, isn't it? You need that same input to produce.
Well, it makes me think of that saying, the cobbler's children have no shoes,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
right?
Completely.
Well,
like my dad always got his own tax return in late because he'd been doing everybody else's. So.
Yeah. And, I think this is just a great reminder of taking a step back, replenishing, refilling the well, and staying in touch with what is your kind of makeup, like, of sorts, right? Are you someone who gets energized by other people? Do you find it draining? Like, what environment or situation do you thrive in, and how can you do more of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think a big thing is always firstly reminding yourself why you started doing this thing you do in the first place, and asking yourself if you're still getting that same kind of buzz from it. But also, and this is the thing that I am terrible at, and I know a lot of people are terrible at, take a moment to see how far you've come. Because last summer I was like, I have to write another book, I've not got an idea. I was at the end of a contract at the time, so I didn't even know if I was going to get another contract. And people who are listening to this who are waiting for news, there will be some soon, and I didn't stop to think, 3 years ago, you hadn't even finished writing your first book. And now you've got 3 books published. You've got a literary agent. All these things that you dreamt of, that you really wanted to happen, have happened. How good is that? But I think we often are so focused on what's next that we forget all that. And that is very powerful, stopping to think about how far you come, stopping to think about past you and how she would feel if she knew she was going to get these things that she wanted.
Beautiful. Yes. And as you said, the connecting to the why, because it's so easy to lose sight of that, because sometimes it's just like, well, because I've always done it. And that's just, what I do. But why? It's like,
is it still relevant?
Right.
Is it still what you want? Because we all change.
Right.
Everyone changes. And it's like you said, I don't know how long you had Tranquil Space for. 15 years?
18
years. I mean, it's a long time, and people change in 18 years, but you kind of keep doing it because it's like, oh, this is what I do. This is what people know me. And I felt like that when I stopped teaching yoga. I was like, but everyone knows me as the person who teaches yoga. And now I'm not that person who teaches yoga anymore. But that's okay, because that's life, I think. It can be very hard to let go of that kind of idea of who you have been to go and be who you're going to be next. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you have to let go of that in order to make space to
otherwise you don't
out.
have the space to do it, because you can't do 3 jobs at once or whatever. No one can.
Right.
Believe me, I've tried.
Exactly.
And no one can.
Well, thank thank you so much, Rachel. I think
You're
for sharing.
very welcome.
Yeah.
It's so lovely to be on here because I've been listening to this podcast for a long time. I think I first came across your blog when around about the time your first book came out.
Okay, so 06. 06, 07,
06, 07, something like that, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's been, so I've been following along for a long time. So it's wonderful to be on here and to chat.
Absolutely. And thank you. I mean, really, I think a lot of the things that you shared today are just such great nuggets. And, and so I appreciate it. Thank you.
That's okay.
So in the show notes, you will find links to find the lovely Rachel on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Amazon, her website, which is Rachel Burton Writes. You'll also find resources to her latest book, which is coming out, TearoomBay, and then also link to my podcast that I mentioned with Dr. Alyssa Adams. Would love for you to have a listen. Let me know what you think. Then also a link to the Daybook. Finally, I wanted to mention if you are interested in being involved in our online book club, we are reading More Than Enough. And there's a lot of information about that over on the blog. And then also, we're reading along and sharing feedback in the Tranquility du Jour Facebook group, the Tranquility du Jour Insiders Facebook group. And of course, would love to have you join us for that. If you're new to Tranquility du Jour, there's a Learn More here. Link in the show notes, and also sign up for weekly love notes. I love sharing invites, inspiration, and more. There's a link to my books and planner, ways to follow along via social media, and then also a link to my seasonless vegan, locally made, eco-friendly fashion line, Tranquility, soon to be TDJ by Kimberly. And finally, if you have a moment to share a review of this podcast on iTunes, Amazon, or Goodreads, I would be so, so grateful. And there are details for this over in the show notes, KimberlyWilson.com/review. So wishing you a delightful week ahead. Be sure to follow along on our farmhouse adventures, and I'll be back next week with more in the wellness world. For the next few weeks, we're going to be exploring wellness. Namaste.